The courtroom was abuzz with hushed whispers as spectators, reporters, and legal professionals gathered in anticipation. This wasn't just another routine hearing, it was the trial of Blake Harrington III, the infamous playboy heir to the Harrington Empire. His family's name carried weight in business and political circles. But today, that name stood in stark contrast to the reality he faced: criminal charges of reckless endangerment and destruction of property. The grand oak doors swung open, and Blake strutted in, exuding the kind of arrogance that only came from a lifetime of unchecked privilege. He walked with the confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences. Dressed in an immaculately tailored navy blue Armani suit with a silk pocket square, his platinum cufflinks gleaming under the fluorescent lights, he looked less like a defendant and more like a billionaire CEO arriving at a shareholders' meeting. He barely acknowledged the courtroom staff, his gaze sweeping across the room with an air of detached superiority. His lawyer, a weary-looking man in his 40s, was already seated at the defense table, nervously adjusting his tie. Blake, however, took his time, sauntering over with the deliberate ease of someone who had never rushed for anything in his life. He plopped into his chair and crossed his legs leisurely, as if the hearing were nothing more than a minor inconvenience in his otherwise glamorous schedule. At the front of the room, Judge Angela Roberts observed him with a measured gaze. She was an imposing figure, not in stature, but in presence. A woman of sharp intellect and unwavering principles. She had spent decades earning her place behind the bench, overcoming biases that many in her position never had to face. Her dark brown eyes held no amusement, no intimidation, only the quiet power of someone who had seen countless men like Blake before. The courtroom clerk stood. Case number 02456, the State of New York versus Blake Harrington III. Blake barely glanced up. Instead, he let out an exaggerated sigh, and checked his Rolex. The sheer audacity of his demeanor sent ripples of murmurs through the courtroom. Judge Roberts ignored the murmurs and turned her attention to the defendant. Mr. Harrington? You stand accused of reckless endangerment, property damage, and leaving the scene of an accident. How do you plead? Blake leaned back in his chair, stretching as if he were lounging poolside instead of facing criminal charges. With a smirk, he finally responded. Not guilty. Obviously. His voice dripped with derision, as though the very question was beneath him. Judge Roberts narrowed her eyes but kept her voice steady. Obviously. Blake shrugged, barely concealing his amusement. Come on, Your Honor. We both know how this works. A little fine, some paperwork, maybe a lecture about responsibility, and we all go home. He flashed her a self-assured grin. No need to waste anyone's time. A few gasps sounded from the audience. Even his lawyer looked horrified. Judge Roberts folded her hands. I see. And is that how you believe justice works, Mr. Harrington? He chuckled under his breath. That's how the world works, Your Honor. No offense. But do you really think throwing some legal jargon at me is going to change anything? My family's attorneys have handled bigger cases than this. There was no remorse in his voice. No recognition of wrongdoing, just sheer, unwavering entitlement. Judge Roberts let a brief silence settle before speaking again. Let's go over the facts. You were caught on camera speeding through a residential neighborhood. You crashed into a parked vehicle, belonging to a single mother of two, and left without so much as a glance back. You showed complete disregard for the well-being of anyone around you. Blake rolled his eyes. No one got hurt. Not this time, she said pointedly. Blake laughed. shaking his head. Look. I'll pay for her little car or whatever. Hell. I'll buy her a new one. What's the issue? The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Judge Roberts tapped her gavel once. The issue, Mr. Harrington, is your blatant disregard for the law and your complete lack of accountability. Blake tilted his head. I'm being accountable. I said I'd pay. What more do you want? Community service. A public apology. Sure. Fine. Just let me know what it'll take to get out of here so we can all move on. His casual dismissal of the entire situation was grating. And Judge Roberts could see exactly the kind of man he was, one who had never been told no. One who thought money was the solution to everything. She took a deep breath. Then set down her papers. Mr. Harrington? You believe that because you were born into privilege. The law does not apply to you. Blake gave a lazy smirk. I wouldn't say that exactly. But you said it? Not me. Judge Roberts didn't blink. Very well. Since you believe your money can solve all your problems, let's put that theory to the test. Blake arched an eyebrow. Meaning? She picked up a document and signed it with a flourish. Then she looked directly at him. Bail is denied. A stunned silence filled the courtroom. Even Blake's confidence faltered for a second before he let out a short laugh. That's a joke. Right? Judge Roberts remained unfazed. You will be remanded to custody until your trial. Blake's smirk returned. Albeit smaller. You can't do that. I have a legal team. And they are welcome to file an appeal, she said smoothly. But until then, you'll remain in custody. The bailiffs approached. And for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty passed over Blake's face. But it was gone just as quickly as it had appeared. As the bailiffs reached for his arms, he didn't resist. Nor did he panic. Instead, he simply smirked again, shaking his head in amusement. This is cute, he muttered. Real cute. His lawyer tried to protest. But Judge Roberts had already banged her gavel. Court adjourned. As Blake was led away, his posture remained relaxed, as if he were merely humoring the system rather than being subjected to it. Enjoy the headlines, he called over his shoulder, flashing his signature cocky grin. This is gonna be a great story. But as the doors closed behind him and he was escorted toward the holding cells, reality would soon begin to set in. For the first time in his life, Blake Harrington III was no longer in control. Blake Harrington III sat on the cold metal bench in the holding cell, his legs crossed as if he were lounging in a VIP suite rather than a jail. The cell was small and unremarkable, with peeling paint on the walls and a faint, lingering smell of sweat and disinfectant. The other inmates, some quiet, some glaring at him with disinterest, were an odd contrast to the usual crowd he surrounded himself with. Yet, despite the bleak surroundings, Blake remained unfazed. If anything, he found the entire situation amusing. He leaned back against the wall, drumming his fingers against his knee, his smirk never faltering. The guard at the door, a stocky man with graying hair and tired eyes, glanced at him with mild curiosity. You're taking this pretty well, he said. Blake chuckled. Why wouldn't I? This is just temporary. He gestured around the cell. It's like a bad hotel with extra security. The guard shook his head. Yeah. Let's see how you feel after a few nights. Blake's confidence didn't waver. He had no doubt that his father's legal team was already pulling strings behind the scenes. Maybe they'd file an emergency motion, get him out by morning. His father, Blake Harrington Jr., was one of the most influential real estate developers in the country. Money spoke louder than any judge's ruling. And Blake knew it was only a matter of time before the system bent in his favor. The other inmates weren't nearly as entertained. A man with a rough beard and tattooed arms eyed him from across the cell. "You think you're better than us, rich boy?" Blake turned his gaze to him and grinned. "I don't think, I know." A few murmurs of amusement came from the other inmates. But the tattooed man wasn't laughing. He stood, towering over Blake. "You got a smart mouth, pretty boy." Blake, still seated, merely tilted his head. "And you've got anger issues. Maybe jail's exactly where you belong." A few guards took notice of the tension. But before the situation could escalate, another inmate, a burly older man, let out a low chuckle. "Leave him be, Carlos. He's not worth the trouble." Carlos shot Blake one last glare before stepping back. Blake remained relaxed, unfazed. Though internally, he made a mental note to be slightly more careful with his words. After a few more hours, an officer arrived to escort him. Blake stood up with a flourish, dusting off his suit as if shaking off the dirt of a peasant's world. "Finally," he muttered. "Took them long enough." But instead of leading him out the front door, the officer took him through a series of metal gates, deeper into the facility. Blake frowned. I think you're making a mistake. Shouldn't I be heading towards my release paperwork?" The officer didn't respond. They reached another set of bars. And the heavy doors slid open. Inside, an actual jail cell awaited him, this time. Not a temporary holding area, but the real deal. Concrete walls, a thin cot, and an iron toilet in the corner. Blake's smirk finally faltered. "You've got to be kidding me." The officer locked the door behind him. "Welcome to your new home, Mr. Harrington. You'll be staying here until further notice." Blake turned to face the officer fully, his brows furrowing. "No. No. No. You don't understand? I'm not staying here. This is a mistake." "No mistake," the officer said. "Judge's orders. You're being held without bail." Blake let out a sharp laugh. "This is ridiculous. I can make a phone call, right?" The officer smirked. "Of course. But I wouldn't expect miracles." Blake pulled himself together. This was nothing but a bump in the road. He was Blake Harrington III, this wasn't how his story went. A few hours later, Blake was on the phone with his father's lawyer, Jonathan Pierce. The man had been on retainer for the Harringtons for over a decade. And Blake expected him to have the situation under control. "All right, Jonathan. Tell me the good news," Blake said, leaning against the wall with an air of detached amusement. But the voice on the other end wasn't as reassuring as Blake had hoped. "Blake? Listen to me. This is serious." Blake rolled his eyes. "Come on. How serious can it be? Just tell my father to do what he always does, pull some strings. Make some calls. I'll be out by dinner." There was a long pause. Then Jonathan sighed. "It's not that simple this time. Judge Roberts isn't budging. She made it clear she won't grant bail. And if we try to pressure her, it could backfire." Blake clenched his jaw. "Pressure her? Who said anything about pressure? We own half the city. What's stopping us from making a few strategic donations?" "Blake?" Jonathan's voice was firm. "You don't get it. This judge isn't like the others we've dealt with. She's got a spotless reputation. And if we try to play games, it'll only make things worse. Your father already tried calling some people. But no one wants to touch this." Blake's smirk disappeared entirely. "So what are you saying? That I have to just sit here? For now?" "Yes. But we're working on an appeal. It'll take a few days." "A few days?" Blake's voice rose. "Jonathan, I can't stay here for a few days. Do you have any idea who I am?" "I do," Jonathan said, his tone growing exasperated. "But so does everyone else. And that's exactly why this is happening. You've pissed off the wrong judge." Blake gritted his teeth. "Unbelievable. What's my father saying about all this?" There was another pause. And for the first time, Jonathan hesitated. "Blake? He's disappointed." Blake felt something sharp twist in his stomach. Disappointed. That single word carried more weight than he cared to admit. "He's waiting to see how this plays out," Jonathan continued. "But he made it clear, he won't publicly intervene." Blake scoffed, though his fingers gripped the phone tighter. "So? What? He's just going to let me rot in here? He's letting us handle it through the legal system," Jonathan corrected. "Which means? For now? You need to keep your head down and stay out of trouble." Blake inhaled deeply, his jaw tightening. "Fine. Just fix it." He slammed the phone back onto the receiver and turned toward the cell door. His arrogance remained intact. But underneath it, something else was bubbling, an emotion he hadn't felt in years. Frustration? For the first time in his life. Money and influence weren't working. And that was a problem. As night fell, the fluorescent lights in the jail dimmed slightly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Blake sat on the edge of his cot, arms crossed, staring at the ceiling. This was temporary. It had to be. But as the hours stretched on and the sounds of distant shouting echoed through the facility, he couldn't shake a nagging thought: what if, for the first time ever, he wasn't in control? Blake Harrington III had always believed in one fundamental truth: money could solve any problem. But as the days passed in his cold, cramped jail cell, that belief was starting to crack. The first night had been easy enough. He had convinced himself it was just an inconvenience, a minor setback that would be resolved by morning. But morning came, and nothing changed. Then another day. And another. His lawyer's calls became more sporadic. And each time, the message was the same: Judge Roberts isn't budging. The appeal is in process. Just sit tight. Blake wasn't used to sitting tight. He wasn't used to waiting at all. His life had always moved at his pace, dictated by his desires. Now, he was just another inmate in an orange jumpsuit, waiting for someone else to decide his fate. At first, he had tried to maintain his usual arrogant demeanor. He walked around with the same self-assured smirk, treating the guards and inmates like they were beneath him. But the longer he stayed inside, the less amusing it became. His fellow inmates weren't impressed by his wealth. In the real world, people fawned over his name, his family, his money. In here, none of that mattered. At meal times, he sat alone, pushing the bland, rubbery food around his plate with disgust. He had made a few snide comments about the quality of the meals on his first day. But after receiving nothing but cold stares in response, he decided to keep those thoughts to himself. He tried making small talk with a few of the other inmates, but the conversations never lasted long. "So, What are you in for? Blake asked casually one afternoon, leaning back on the metal bench in the common area. A tall, heavy-set man with a shaved head looked at him with mild amusement. Armed robbery. Blake blinked. Oh. The man smirked. What about you? Rich boy. Tax fraud. Insider trading. Blake rolled his eyes. Reckless driving. Technically. But it's ridiculous. I barely did anything. Some judge with a chip on her shoulder just wants to make an example out of me. The man chuckled. Yeah. You keep telling yourself that. Blake frowned. What's that supposed to mean? The man shrugged. You really don't get it. Do you? You think this is just some little misunderstanding? That your fancy lawyers will swoop in, and everything will go back to normal? He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. But I've seen guys like you before. You think you're untouchable, until the system decides you aren't. Blake clenched his jaw. I am untouchable. The man laughed. Not in here. You're not. That conversation stuck with Blake. 3 days in, the real test of his patience came. It was late. Past lights out. And Blake was lying on his cot, staring at the ceiling. The sounds of the jail never truly stopped, metal doors clanging. Distant conversations. Occasional shouts from down the hall. Then came the voices outside his cell. I'm just saying. Maybe he needs a little lesson. Someone muttered. Blake stiffened. He recognized the voice, Carlos. The tattooed inmate who had taken an instant dislike to him on his first day. You really wanna mess with that guy? Another voice said. Quieter. He's got money. Carlos scoffed. Money don't mean shit in here. Blake's heartbeat quickened. But he forced himself to remain calm. He wasn't going to cower in some jail cell. Footsteps stopped outside his door. Then came the low, taunting voice. You still awake? Rich boy. Blake didn't respond. I bet you ain't used to sleeping in a place like this. Bet you're used to silk sheets and penthouses. You know what we call guys like you in here. Silence. Fresh meat. Blake sat up, swinging his legs off the cot. You gonna keep talking? Or you actually plan to do something? There was a brief pause, almost as if Carlos hadn't expected him to bite back. Then came a low chuckle. Oh. You got some fight in you. Ha. Before anything could escalate, the sound of approaching footsteps cut through the tension. Break it up. A guard barked. Move along. Carlos. Carlos hesitated for a moment longer, then laughed under his breath. Sleep tight, rich boy. The footsteps faded away. Blake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Maybe for the first time in his life. He felt something he wasn't used to. Vulnerability the next morning. Blake sat across from Jonathan Pierce in the small, sterile meeting room reserved for attorney visits. The older man looked tired. His suit slightly wrinkled. Blake leaned forward. Tell me you've got good news, Jonathan sighed. The appeal is still pending. We're looking at least another week before we can get in front of a judge. Blake's hands clenched into fists. A week. I can't stay in here for a week. You don't have a choice, Jonathan said bluntly. Blake slammed his palm on the table, startling the lawyer. This is insane. You're supposed to be fixing this. Jonathan rubbed his temples. You think I haven't tried? Your father's tried, too. But Judge Roberts isn't bending. The media's watching this case. Blake? If we try anything shady, it'll only make things worse. Blake exhaled sharply, shaking his head. So, what am I supposed to do? Just wait? Jonathan met his eyes. Yeah. And while you're waiting, I suggest you stop making enemies. Blake scoffed. I don't make enemies. People just don't like that I'm better than them, Jonathan sighed. You really don't get it. Do you? Blake frowned. Get what? That in here. Your last name means nothing. Your money means nothing. The only thing that matters is how you carry yourself. Blake crossed his arms. And what's that supposed to mean? Jonathan stood up, gathering his papers. It means if you keep acting like you're untouchable, someone's gonna take that as a challenge. Blake watched as Jonathan turned to leave. For the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as untouchable as he thought. Blake Harrington III sat on the hard cot of his jail cell, staring at the dull concrete wall. The days had blended together, each one stretching longer than the last. The novelty of his situation had worn off. And for the first time, a sense of unease settled in his chest. It wasn't just the discomfort, the thin mattress, the bad food, or the lack of privacy. It was the realization that, in here, no one cared about his name, his wealth, or his father's influence. At first, he had assumed this was just a temporary setback, a small inconvenience that would be resolved in a matter of hours. Then it became days. And now, the uncertainty gnawed at him. His lawyer's updates were no longer filled with confidence, instead. Jonathan's voice carried frustration, warning him that Judge Roberts wasn't going to be easily swayed. Blake wasn't used to feeling powerless. The other inmates still regarded him with amusement, some ignoring him altogether while others watched him with quiet curiosity. He had managed to avoid direct conflict, though he could tell that his usual arrogance wasn't winning him any favors. One afternoon, during recreation time, Blake sat on a bench in the common area, absent-mindedly bouncing his knee. Across from him, an older inmate, broad-shouldered, with graying hair and a calm demeanor, watched him with quiet amusement. You look like a guy who's never had to wait for anything, the man said. Blake scoffed. What gave it away? The man chuckled. The way you're fidgeting. The way you look around, expecting something to change. News flash. Kid, nothing moves fast in here. Blake exhaled sharply. Yeah. Well? I'm not supposed to be here in the first place. The man raised an eyebrow. That's so. Blake folded his arms. I barely did anything. A little reckless driving. Sure. But I don't belong here with criminals. The man leaned back. And what exactly makes you different? Blake frowned. Because I have a life outside of this. A future. Connections? The man nodded slowly. You ever think maybe that's why you're here? Maybe Judge Roberts or something in you that needed fixing? Blake let out a bitter laugh. What? You think this is some kind of life lesson? That she locked me up just to teach me a lesson in humility? The man shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe she just wanted you to see what life is like for people who don't have money to bail them out of every mistake. Blake didn't respond right away. He had never truly considered what life was like for people without wealth, without options. He had never had to. For the first time, he started to wonder if he had been born into a different family, without the Harrington name. Would he still be sitting here? Would anyone have cared? A few days later, Blake was summoned back to court. He sat quietly in the holding area, his hands resting on his lap, waiting for his name to be called. When he was finally led into the courtroom, Judge Roberts was already seated, her sharp eyes studying him as he approached. Unlike his first appearance, he didn't walk with a swagger or a smirk. He didn't sigh in exasperation or roll his eyes. Instead, he stood before her with an unfamiliar sense of restraint. "Mr. Harrington?" Judge Roberts began. "You have spent the past several days in custody. Have you learned anything from this experience?" Blake hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "I have, Your Honor." Her expression remained unreadable. "And what is it that you've learned?" Blake glanced down for a moment before meeting her gaze again. "That I've taken a lot for granted. That I've spent my life assuming the rules don't apply to me because they never have." He paused. "And that I was wrong." A murmur ran through the courtroom. His lawyer, Jonathan, looked at him in surprise. Judge Roberts studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "I hope you mean that, Mr. Harrington," she said. "Because this court does not exist to serve the privileged. It exists to uphold justice." Blake nodded. "I understand." She tapped her gavel lightly. "In light of your time served and your acknowledgement of responsibility, the court will grant your release under strict probation. You will also be required to complete community service and attend a restorative justice program." Blake exhaled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. As he stepped out of the courtroom, the bright sunlight outside felt different, harsher, more real. He wasn't sure how much he had changed. But one thing was certain. Blake Harrington III would never look at the world the same way again. How do you feel about this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your feedback to improve even more. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our latest videos. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.